a right of unilateral secession. Can a province like Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Quebec separate from Canada? Do these provinces own the natural resources of these provinces? The answer to that is no. This is why. While secession with the consent of the metropolitan state is a right rarely challenged, the alleged right of unilateral secession under international law is laden with controversy. In the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, adopted by the General Assembly in 1960, Section 6, it is stated that any attempt aimed at the partial or total disruption of the national unity and the territorial integrity of a country is incompatible with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. This paragraph undoubtedly rejects a right of secession, but the formulation is subsequently restricted in the Friendly Relations Declaration, adopted by the General Assembly in 1970. Principle 5, Section 7 of the Friendly Relations Declaration protects the territorial integrity of states, conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, representing the whole people belonging to the territory without distinction as to race, creed, or color. The aforementioned formulation is basically repeated in Article 1 of the 1993 Vienna Declaration and in Article 1 of the Declaration on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, adopted in 1995, hereafter 50th Anniversary Declaration. An obvious conclusion drawn from the provision is that territorial integrity is not guaranteed in a case in which a state does not respect the right to self-determination of peoples, discriminating a subgroup through denying its right to internal self-determination. The territorial integrity of states is limited through its own non-compliance with the right to self-determination of peoples. As determined above, the provision is directed towards states, which means that the dismemberment or impairment of state territorial integrity refers to actions of other states. The international community could thereby legally take action if a state grossly violates the internal dimension of self-determination. Such action taken by the international community can be aid or recognition of independence of the discriminated seceding entity, which would otherwise be perceived as illicit. An act of secession may then be authorized or encouraged by other states. Numerous scholars have argued that the provision entails a right for so-called remedial secession, a right for peoples to secede under certain circumstances as a last resort, as an ultimum remedium. In a situation in which a state deliberately and sustainably discriminates a part of the population and does thus not represent the whole population, the right to self-determination would, if not remedial secession was included, be a hollow shell for the entity in question. The possibility of a right to remedial secession implicitly been acknowledged in several judicial decisions which are explored below. Merzweig, page 24. World Conference on Human Rights, Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, 12th of July 1993. UN Doc, UFCON 57-23, ILM 1661. 1993 Vienna Declaration. UNGA Declaration on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations Res. 56, 9th of November 1995, 50th Session, UN Doc A 5048, 50th Anniversary Declaration. Johansson, page 70. It cannot be use of force other than through the decision of the UN Security Council. See Johansson, page 123. Oder, page 114. Principle Vive, Section 7 Friendly Relations Declaration, Art 1, 2. 1993 Vienna Declaration and Art 1, 3, 50th Anniversary Declaration. See example Buchheit pages 2 and 21 to 23, Cassis page 118, Anderson pages 358 to 368. Merzweig, 26. It is clear and practically beyond dispute that the right to self-determination of peoples does not contain an unconditional right of secession. Oder. Supreme Court of Canada, reference Resecession of Quebec, 1998, Canli 793, 1998, 2 SCR 217. Quebec could not, despite a clear referendum result, purport to invoke a right of self-determination to dictate the terms of a proposed secession to the other parties to the Federation. The Democratic vote, by however strong a majority, would have no legal effect on its own and could not push aside the principles of federalism and the rule of law, the rights of individuals and minorities, or the operation of democracy in the other provinces or in Canada as a whole. Democratic rights under the Constitution cannot be divorced from constitutional obligations. Nor, however, can the reverse proposition be accepted. The continued existence and operation of the Canadian constitutional order could not be indifferent to a clear expression of a clear majority of Quebecers that they no longer wish to remain in Canada. The other provinces and the federal government would have no basis to deny the right of the government of Quebec to pursue secession should a clear majority of the people of Quebec choose that goal, so long as in doing so, Quebec respects the rights of others. The negotiations that followed such a vote would address the potential act of secession as well as its possible terms should in fact secession proceed. There would be no conclusions predetermined by law on any issue. Negotiations would need to address the interests of the other provinces, the federal government and Quebec, and indeed the rights of all Canadians both within and outside Quebec, and specifically the rights of minorities. The negotiation process would require the reconciliation of various rights and obligations by negotiation between two legitimate majorities, namely, the majority of the population of Quebec and that of Canada as a whole. A political majority at either level that does not act in accordance with the underlying constitutional principles puts at risk the legitimacy of its exercise of its rights and the ultimate acceptance of the result by the international community. The court was also required to consider whether a right to unilateral secession exists under international law. Some supporting an affirmative answer did so on the basis of the recognized right to self-determination that belongs to all peoples. Although much of the Quebec population certainly shares many of the characteristics of a people, it is not necessary to decide the people issue because, whatever may be the correct determination of this issue in the context of Quebec, a right to secession only arises under the principle of self-determination of people at international law, where a people is governed as part of a colonial empire, where a people is subject to alien subjugation, domination, or exploitation, and possibly where a people is denied any meaningful exercise of its right to self-determination within the state of which it forms a part. In other circumstances, peoples are expected to achieve self-determination within the framework of their existing state. A state whose government represents the whole of the people or peoples resident within its territory on a basis of equality and without discrimination, and respects the principles of self-determination in its internal arrangements, is entitled to maintain its territorial integrity under international law and to have that territorial integrity recognized by other states. Quebec does not meet the threshold of a colonial people or an oppressed people, nor can it be suggested that Quebecers have been denied meaningful access to government to pursue their political, economic, cultural, and social development. In the circumstances, the National Assembly, the legislature, or the government of Quebec do not enjoy a right at international law to effect the secession of Quebec from Canada unilaterally. Secession means separation of provinces or territories. If Quebec cannot separate from Canada or Catalan from Spain, then neither can Alberta. The premiers do not have final say over their provinces, nor does Alberta or Saskatchewan own the oil or any minerals, etc. All resources in Canada belong to all Canadians and Indigenous peoples. Let me repeat, at international law, it is clear and practically beyond dispute that the right to self-determination of peoples does not contain an unconditional right of secession. At international law, states are countries. Provinces are not countries. All Canadians, plus all Indigenous peoples of Canada, even the Indigenous in the USA, would have to say yes, and only then could it be done. But why would any of us allow that to ever happen? Together, we the people own it all. No Prime Minister or Premier has any rights to our resources within the whole of Canada since 1982. There are other reasons why separation of a province or territory cannot legally happen within Canada or internationally, but these are the most relevant. Our official decolonization, April 17, 1982, at UK, Canadian, and international law made the peoples of Canada the official political and civil rights holders over our government and country. However, the federal and provincial leaders failed to announce it and give us our legal and lawful rights as determined and specified by international law. The provinces should have been trading equally within Canada without provincial borders. To steal our rights, they perpetrated the lies by remaining the same as if we were still run as colonies by illegally circumventing our collective rights. The Canadian government has had an obligation to hold a nationwide constitutional referendum for its citizens, predating the Canada Act 1982 request by the Parliament and Senate to the United Kingdom, which only partially patriated the Constitution on April 17, 1982. The UK Commonwealth Foreign Affairs stated that due to the government not having held a referendum prior to the constitutional patriation from the UK, the Imperial Parliament could not proceed as Trudeau had hoped with the patriation. Instead, Pierre Elliott Trudeau was obliged to accept post-patriation amendments that have yet to be fulfilled 42 years later, and kept it from the people to this day. Constitutional amendments can only be accepted by the Imperial Parliament in accordance with the wishes of the people of the Dominion as a whole, not at either federal or provincial bidding. Decolonization, patriation of the 1982 constitutional coup d'état, should have given complete independence and the full power to the people to choose what we decide together in regard to our own country. This was never finalized and served as a parliamentary and provincial inside coup d'état against the peoples of Canada. This coup d'état was further extended as of April 17, 1997, to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and now to His Majesty King Charles III as Canada's heads of state. Therefore, the Canadian people hold the prerogative to rectify the purported 1982 coup d'état, which allegedly undermined the constitutional patriation of the Canada Act 1982, orchestrated by Pierre Elliott Trudeau's Liberal government, Parliament, Senate, and the provincial premiers. The Canadian government enacted the legislation without securing a mandatory referendum from affected Canadians regarding keeping the monarchy or the Canada Act 1982. Because we were not given a referendum on these issues and on how we wanted to govern ourselves, the Canada Act 1982 was enforced without our consent, thus maintaining the Crown and Parliament's supremacy over the people. Foreseeing democracy, parliamentary democracy, as the only legitimate outcome, cannot truly be considered a free act of self-determination. The Canadian government has repeatedly violated the international legal instruments it pledged to uphold, undermining the rights and dignity of all Canadians. Regrettably, previous governments have also committed numerous human rights abuses since 1982, with the situation worsening significantly in the past 4 years. In a statement made during the parliamentary meetings, Sir B. Brain stated that the Canada Bill sent to the UK by the Canadian government that certain parts of the Charter breached the international agreements that both Canada and the UK had ratified. There is much more shocking information within the Hansards that indicates that a coup d'état was committed against us by our own government and by every other government for the past 42 years since. The evidence suggests a systematic undermining of democratic processes by governmental authorities over the past 4 decades. See discussions in UK Parliament regarding Canada Bill 1982, Canada Bill Hansard. UK House of Commons Debate 17 February 1982, Volume 18 CC 292-373. My honourable friend, the member for Essex South East, Sir B. Brain, has shown clearly and cogently how certain parts of that charter offend and infringe 2 international agreements to which we are signatories, Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Articles 1 and 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Some of us may not wish to be signatories to those 2 agreements, but we are bound by them. So long as we choose to be fettered by those covenants, they remain shackles upon the House, and we should recoil from any legislation that infringes upon them. To do otherwise would be dishonorable, even disreputable. It is of course true that Canada is also a signatory to both agreements, but whether she decides to infringe them is not a matter for us. Two wrongs cannot make a right. The Indian nations are justified in questioning the bona fides of the Canadian Prime Minister. I say that with great regret. As long ago as 1969, he spoke in Vancouver about the need to bring to an end the historic treaty rights of the Indian peoples, and spoke of how in due course those rights must be extinguished. He refuses even now to sit at the conference table to discuss and define what those rights are. He will not do so until the new Constitution of Canada is established, and at that stage, he will have the power to override the Indians. That is our dilemma. We do not wish to offend Canada, but if we pass the bill in its present form, we shall infringe two international agreements and at the same time disregard the rights of the Indian nations given under 83 treaties between them and the British sovereign. For that reason, I shall find it difficult to support the bill. People's referendum purpose. This referendum is a legally binding living agreement between the signatories to achieve the required 51% of Canadians being in agreement with this referendum within a minimum of 7 provinces to reach a fair majority of our citizens. This referendum is to be combined in conjunction with the Indigenous and Civil Unified Sovereign Enactment, Citizens' Convention of Consent to Collective Self-Determination and Self-Governance, within a combined direct democracy system of governance. Please share this video so that we can stop people from spreading unwarranted lies. For more information, join the Canadian People's Union at the cpu.ca and sign your referendum placing the people as collective head of state at canadianreferendum.ca. Thank you.